Today we're going to talk about the sometimes thorny issue of proxying miniatures versus playing what you see as what you get. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today's going to be a bit more of a discussion focused video around the fairly grey line with what's acceptable and what isn't with proxying models in 40k. I'm sure a lot of us will have some sort of story to tell with unusual substitute miniatures being used by the player on the other side of the table, and I know it's a subject that a lot of people have some fairly strong opinions on. So what are WYSIWYG and proxying? WYSIWYG is what you see is what you get, and basically means if you have a model with that war gear on the table, then that's what that war gear represents. If you're playing absolutely strictly to WYSIWYG, you won't be using any rules or abilities that aren't represented by their appropriate war gear on your models on the tabletop. Proxying represents the pretty commonly used practice of not adhering quite so strictly to this, and some of your squads and models might be using weapons or abilities that they aren't modelled with, or you might have some miniatures standing in for entirely other models that you don't yet own. Now there are quite a lot of advantages to proxying miniatures, particularly when it comes to gameplay. In Warhammer 40K and 8th edition in particular, the rules are frequently FAQ'd and updated, meaning that what's the strongest thing one day certainly might not be in 6 months' time. So if you're trying to run a fairly optimised list, then you might have your miniatures modelled with war gear that isn't exactly optimal for the situation. So having a couple of simple proxies in the army can be a way to get your army to gain a lot of power. It can also be a way to try out the rules for new models that you're thinking about purchasing but haven't yet added to your army. And it can be a way to just purchase fewer models in general, particularly when you have some units or things that look very similar in the same army, and you don't really have any desire to add another copy of that unit with a slightly different war gear option. I think the Intercessor bolt rifles are an absolutely great example of this. Intercessors can be armed with auto, stalker or regular bolt rifles, and I'm sure that the people at Games Workshop would absolutely love you to go out and buy an entirely new set of Intercessors if you wanted to access the different set of rules for the other bolt rifle. If we as a player base are a little bit more happy to be flexible with this and allow people to run their bolt rifles as different options despite the small visual differences, then we'll save people buying 3 sets of Intercessors if they want to have the flexibility to run different sorts of bolt rifles on their list. You might also want to proxy as you've made some cool conversion miniatures. They might not be technically exactly what Games Workshop sold to represent those rules, but converting is a massive and really fun part of the hobby, and by allowing proxy miniatures, we get to see a whole lot more hobby creative effort on the table. In terms of converting, you can get around proxying miniatures with good use of magnets, and I use them frequently on my own units, but I accept that it is a skill that a lot of new players won't necessarily be able to do straight away, and some units are much easier to magnetize than others. So I think there really are quite a lot of good advantages to being able to be a bit flexible and allowing proxy miniatures in the game, particularly in a more casual setting. In general though, I would say that when you can and when it's convenient, it is more polite to use WYSIWYG whenever that's possible. I think there's 2 main advantages to using WYSIWYG models in a game. The first is just the visual aesthetic of Warhammer 40k. A lot of the enjoyment comes from having 2 nicely painted armies duking it out on the tabletop. That's a lot more of an immersive experience if your men are actually firing the guns that they have, rather than representing completely different things on the table, such as this Necron acting up as a Space Marine suppressor. It's just generally not quite as satisfying a visual experience if you're a player who's put a lot of time and effort into the modelling and representation of their army when they're going up against a whole load of random different units that are all representing different things. The other main issue with proxying is that it can cause confusion for your opponent, and if you're not using the miniatures whose rules they represent, then your opponent might not understand the abilities of your models and make poor choices because of that. Basically, in a competitive game, if you're not even sure what sort of guns your opponent's models have because there's too many confusing proxies on the table, it can be really confusing, and it's just a bit impolite from a rules clarity point of view to your opponent. For this reason, in tournaments and things, WYSIWYG is often mandatory, and any cool conversions or proxies generally need to be submitted to a tournament organiser before the event. I'm sure that a lot of Games Workshop stores also enforce this as well. I can't say that I've played in an actual Warhammer store for a long time, but I'm sure that at least some of them they take a dim view of you using other models to stand in for others, rather than buying the actual models from them. Generally, proxying is a bit of a spectrum, and different people are going to have more of an issue with it than others. In general, with proxying, I generally find that if it doesn't either cause confusion or remove the narrative immersion, then people are generally quite fine with it. Things like the occasional individual weapon swap, such as saying, yes, this character is modelled with a Thunderhammer, but he actually has a Power Fist for this game. Having your own custom converted character rather than a unique character model the Games Workshop produces, or saying before the game, all my intercessors are armed with a Stalker bolt rifle this game, none of them have regular bolt rifles. For the majority of those examples, I think almost everyone that you play will be fairly understanding, as it doesn't really remove too much from the narrative of the mission, and it doesn't cause confusion, provided you're very clear about it. I think when it does start to cause problems is when you have one miniature that on one side of the board can be a different thing and on the other side can be something else. Say with your intercessors, if you said these guys have auto bolt rifles, those ones have stalker bolt rifles, and those have standard ones, and they all look exactly visually the same, then I think that would be far less polite rather than just saying for this game all of them have the stalker bolt rifles for purposes of the rules. The first one can be pretty hard to remember, particularly when the units move around during the game, whereas the second one is very easy to get in your head. It also becomes an issue if you have too many of these individual little swaps. Say every character is armed with a different power weapon to the one that they have, a bunch of troops have different weapon changes, and there's the odd gun on the tank that's changed as well. If you're just doing one or two of those over a game, it really might not be that much of a problem, but if it's happening in multiple places across your entire army, then it's just really not very reasonable to expect your opponent to remember all of that. As a general rule, proxy miniatures should also be the same size and profile for the unit that they're representing. For example, this Necron warrior standing in as a Space Marine suppressor would be a really bad proxy, because he's nowhere near as tall as the suppressors are on their flying bases, and his base size is also smaller, so people will be far less impressed by that on the table, compared with say if you modelled some Assault Marines with some awesome assault cannons, and have them perching on bits of terrain, which means that they're the same height as the suppressors. I think as a general rule, people will be a lot more forgiving if your army looks nice and effort has been made for the miniatures that you're proxying, as this certainly helps with the narrative immersion, and it helps lessen the blow of a few proxies. I know that I'd be a little bit more happy to play against an army that's an absolute visual treat with lots of cool conversions, compared with a grey plastic tide, where some partially assembled models are standing in for some others. Above all, for making things okay from a rules perspective, then communication is the absolute key part with proxy models. If you're playing any sort of competitive game and you're showing your opponent your army list, it's not enough just to give them the army list and expect them to work everything out. If you're using proxies, then you should literally take each model and explain what it will be in this army going forward. That way there's no confusion, and it won't confuse them when your bolter arm scouts start opening up with sniper rifles, for example. It also helps through the game if you keep on just mentioning it whenever you move the units. Say these guys, they're the sniper ones, remember, are moving up here, just to stop your opponent forgetting midway through the game. I've certainly had games where people haven't done this, have just given me their army list and I've skimmed read it, and halfway through the game I was a bit surprised when a whole load of autocannons opened up and turned out to be las cannons, as it could have certainly meant that I prioritised them as targets a bit more. It could have easily been avoided just by my opponent telling me at the start of the game that they were going to be las cannons, and I would have been absolutely fine with it. As a slightly related topic, there's also the thorny issue of paint schemes and accessing rules. This one's certainly one that a lot of people have very differing opinions on. If you're playing an opponent who has an army that's very clearly painted as Ultramarines and has done a really awesome paint job on it, how forgiving would you be if they wanted to play it as White Scars for a game? And would your thinking change at all if you were in a tournament setting? Now I think that this one's quite a tricky one, because it does quite go against the immersion and narrative feature of the game, because if you see an Ultramarines paint job, you'd expect it to be using the Ultramarines rules, which I think really rankles with people. At the same time though, this just really punishes anyone who actually punishes the army the same way that it's painted in the book, as it means that if you just paint your own custom successor chapter, then you can use basically whatever rules that you want. Whereas if you actually follow an Ultramarines paint scheme and enjoy painting that, then it means that you can experience a fair bit of negativity if you try and use it as a different chapter. My personal opinion on this is that I'd far rather play a very nicely painted army that's a visual treat on the other side of the table, and allow them to use different rules from a different book if they wish, if that's stronger, and we were deciding to play some sort of competitive game. I kind of find that it's a bit unreasonable to say that if you want to access the best rules, then you have to strip and repaint your army just to access those rules, as it kind of incentivises people just painting some sort of bland generic colour scheme that can represent multiple armies. I personally find this particularly silly to limit this in a tournament setting, because for me in a tournament the actual focus is the interaction of the rules and sort of like playing model chess, as opposed to strict WYSIWYG on the colour schemes. But I know that some events say that if you have it painted in a certain chapter's colour scheme, then you have to use it as that chapter, including I believe Games Workshop's own events, and I don't think that they're doing the hobbying community any service by doing this. That is just my own personal opinion though, and I know that people have different ideas on this to me. So in summary then, I think that a little proxying is very good for the game, certainly saves us from making lots of unnecessary purchases from Games Workshop, and it only gets to be a problem when it gets out of hand and someone pushes it to its limits. If you do have the option, then playing WYSIWYG as far as you can is great, as it generally leads to a little bit better game immersion and narrative, and better clarity to your opponent. If you are using proxies, then the main thing is to communicate that very clearly and keep your opponent informed through the game. And when it comes to tournaments and things, I feel that a little bit of proxying should be tolerated, with the provision that it causes absolutely no extra confusion to your opponent and doesn't confer a rules advantage. So I'm sure everyone's got lots of different opinions on the subject, and I'd love to hear them down in the comments below, and I'd certainly love to hear any fun horror stories of anyone who's played someone who's managed to proxy half their army and just caused a complete mess. If you'd like to hear more discussion and tactics articles similar to this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We have regular 40k stuff coming out every day. And if you've been watching regularly, then I'd just like to mention the channel's Patreon page, as it's what allows me to keep all these videos coming so regularly and focus more time on the channel away from my real world job. By being a member of the Auspex Tactics Patreon, you get to see some videos early, such as this one itself, which will be coming out a week or so early for Patreon supporters. You also get to vote on upcoming videos for the channel, and there's the occasional prize draw where I post out some miniatures to some lucky Patreon winner. If any of that sounds interesting, or you'd just like to support the channel, then please give a look in the video description below. There is the Patreon link there. And a big thank you to my current Patreons for making all of this possible. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.